All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Martin, and I am the current president of the ISPOR Victoria and Tasmania student chapter. And I welcome you here today for an exciting webinar titled Using Patient-Reported Outcome Measures in Different Population Settings, Methods and Challenges for Decision Making. So before I like to progress any further, I'd like to do acknowledgement of country. We'd like to acknowledge the wonderful people who are traditional custodians of the land that I am on today. And we'll also like to pay respect to elders, both past and present of the Q Nation, and extend our respect to other Indigenous Australians present with us today. So before we begin with our presentations, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. So today's webinar is scheduled to last for 1 hour, including question and answers at the end of the 2 presentations. All participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruptions. And we encourage questions and submit your questions via the Q&A chat box, where there'll be a Q&A at the conclusion of the 2 presentations. But before we go further and introduce the speakers, we want to get to know, want to ask you a few questions and get to know you a little bit more. So we're going to spend 1 or 2 minutes using the Menti platform. So we encourage all of you to go on using your phone or on your desktop to put in menti.com and enter the code, and where we have some few questions relating to about who you are, but also to gauge your understanding about where you're at with patient-reported outcomes and what you want to get out of today's webinar. So I'll leave that for a couple of minutes before I introduce the first speaker. All right, so while that is happening, I'd like to introduce Cate. So Dr. Cate Bailey is a research fellow at the Health Economic Unit, Centre for Health Policy. She is currently working on an MRF project to strengthen tools and evidence on health outcomes for use in decision-making for children, and specialises in health economic methodologies in evaluating social care interventions. Dr. Bailey has a master's degree in applied statistics and PhD in forensic psychology, as well as in health economics. And now I'd like to Cate for you to present your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Can you see the Menti slide there?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So looks like most people postgrad in health economics, which is, I guess, what we'd expect from a student presentation aimed at students. So that's fantastic. Just wait another couple of minutes and just see if anyone who else is coming on. It's exciting to see someone from industry or government, and some researchers not from health economics. Looks like that's good. Great. I just want to check now that you're now seeing my Melbourne University slide. Christine, can you nod? Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'd like to kick off today by asking a little bit about your current role, about the Menti, and that's really interesting. Thank you for that. Will help me tailor the presentation, and great to see how many of us are working in the health economics field. Keep the Mentimeter open because we're going to do a couple more throughout the presentation. So I'm Cate Bailey from the Health Economics Unit, University of Melbourne, and today I'm talking about obtaining and using utility-based measures in the social care environment. I'll give a quick overview first of cost utility analysis, qualities measurement, valuation of utilities, and the difference between healthcare and social care in terms of economic evaluation, and how we can collect meaningful utilities in the social care sector for cost utility analysis. Sounds like I've got a gaggle of kids outside the door because I have, so hope that's not disturbing you. So I've borrowed this slide from one of our University of Melbourne short courses, but I think it's worth going through as it helps to quickly explain where cost utility analysis fits in the suite of economic analysis techniques that we use in the healthcare sector. So is there good evidence on effectiveness of interventions being compared? If no, it's a costing study. If yes, is effectiveness of interventions equal? If yes, it'll be a cost minimization study. If no, can all outcomes be valued in monetary terms? If yes, it could be cost-benefit analysis. If no, is there a measurable unidimensional outcome? If yes, cost-effectiveness analysis. If no, can outcomes be measured as quality-adjusted life years? No, we'd say cost-consequence analysis, and yes, cost-utility analysis. So while cost-effectiveness analysis is used to measure a unidimensional outcome, this outcome may not be the same as in another study, so it's hard to compare the cost-effectiveness across different interventions. Cost-utility analysis uses a preference-adjusted unit of consequence, like a QALY or a DALY, as the outcome measure, and that enables us to compare across interventions for different disease types. For instance, a comparison of a treatment for cancer versus a treatment for diabetes. To generate utility values such as a QALY, we need an instrument that we can develop different preference weights for. So to obtain these preference weights, health economists will often ask a population sample for their preferences about specific health states. And an instrument to capture health utilities usually combines more than one attribute of health, for instance, including both physical health and mental health. A utility commonly used in cost-utility analysis is the quality-adjusted life year, or QALY, and here we combine the length of life with the quality of life in a single measure. QALYs have a specific time dimension, but we need reliable measures of quality of life to calculate them. QALY values generally range between 0 for death and 1 for perfect health. For example, a value of 0.8 indicates that a year lived in that state is worth 0.8 of a year in a perfect health. It's also possible to have states perceived as worse than death, so there can be utility weights less than 0. We assume that utility weights have equal interval properties, such that a given change in absolute value means the same regardless of where you are on the scale. For example, the distance between 0.2 and 0.3 would be the same as the distance between 0.7 and 0.8. As I said, this is an assumption and an area of ongoing research. Some terms you may have come across include patient reported outcome measures, or PROMs, and multi-attribute utility instruments. So PROMs are measures we use to measure outcomes reported by patients and may be disease specific, such as the Asthma Quality of Life Questionnaire, or generic, such as the SF36 or the PEDS-QL, which are both commonly used. Multi-attribute utility instruments are PROMs that are specific to measuring utilities, and there are a number of these commonly used, particularly the EQ5D in Europe and the UK, which is 5 items long and a measure developed, and it's also measure developed in Australia. That's the Assessment of Quality of Life Scale, the AQUAL, which is longer at 15 items, and some others that you can see on the screen there. There are also child-specific instruments, which Christine will be talking about later in the webinar. But if we want to conduct cost utility analysis in the social care sector, what are the differences that we might encounter? Let's first define social care as the sector providing physical, emotional, and social support to help people in their lives, such as children in out-of-home care, aged care, persons experiencing adversity, housing, legal, social, mental health stresses. Calculating the cost of social care is challenging, and a report from 2010 estimated that the cost of paid care in Australia was $111 billion, representing almost 9% of GDP, whilst the cost of unpaid care was staggering at over 50% of GDP. So you can see how important this area is. So I'd like you to go to your Mentimeter again now and just answer the following question, which hang on. So there it goes. So have you worked on an economic analysis in healthcare, in social care, both but mostly healthcare, both but mostly social care, or neither? Just going to leave that up there for a sec. How are people getting onto the Mentimeter? Are you finding that easy? Just pop something up in the chat if you want. So we've got, most people say that they've done, hang on, here's someone come up in the chat, let me just check. No problem, great. So thanks for your input there. It's really interesting to see these responses. And from the literature, we can also see that there are far fewer economic analyses in the social care sector. We can also see that economic analysis methods that are used in the social care sector are generally borrowed from healthcare and may not be as suitable in this context. And there might be multiple barriers to randomisation. Thus, randomised controlled trials are more challenging to conduct in the social care sector. Ethical reasons for this may include withholding an intervention to obtain a control group, the ability to obtain informed consent, and protection of the participants' privacy and confidentiality. Also, many populations in the social care sector are experiencing some sort of adversity, and it can be challenging or even not possible to define a control group. If a control group is included, there is a risk that it may have atypical participants. And another issue is that often the intervention has already been implemented, but we still want to know if it's cost effective. I've just got an example here of some of these issues from a cost effectiveness study that we did using a simple decision tree model of a family preservation program. The program was a timely, short and intense intervention that aimed to keep children at home when the family was in crisis. We had a naturally occurring control group that was formed by families for whom there was no availability in the program at the time. However, the control group was small and the demographics of the control group didn't fully match with the intervention group, suggesting that there may be issues with comparability. Because of this, we conducted threshold analysis to demonstrate what percentage of children remaining at home in the control group would be required for the program to be cost-saving or cost-effective, which we hoped would be useful for policymakers in the future and when more data on children not entering the program was available. So this is the decision tree where participants were in the intervention or control groups, but not by randomisation. And from there, the children either entered the out-of-home care or remained at home. In the graph for the threshold analysis, we have the incremental cost effectiveness ratio here on the y-axis and the percentage of children remaining at home in the control group on the x-axis. And what this shows is that if less than 30% of the children in the control group remained at home, that the intervention would be cost saving. We don't have a willingness to pay figure to work out cost effectiveness, but we would hope that this information would be useful for discussion with policymakers. We also conducted a systematic review of economic evaluation methods used in home visiting interventions, which we used to guide the cost effectiveness study. Of the 21 included studies, many used techniques that would be seen in healthcare, such as cost effectiveness, cost benefit, cost consequence analysis, and one cost utility analysis. Research designs for use when randomisation was not feasible included parallel cluster randomised trials, pre-post intervention effects, a cost study across agencies, and a threshold analysis, which we used in the above study. So as you can see, there was one cost utility analysis where the population was mothers participating in an early childhood prevention program, and that used the EQ5D. So if we want to conduct cost utility analysis in a social care setting, how do we do this when the multi-attribute utility instruments most commonly used, such as the EQ5D, are focused on physical and mental health outcomes? If we want to measure and value utilities for cost utility analysis in the social care sector, then we need measures that are fit for purpose. So for our last Mentimeter for today, hang on, let me just put this onto the next one. Just going to ask, what are some of the quality of life concepts or areas that we may want to measure in social care wellbeing context rather than in healthcare? Just going to say that again. So what are some of the quality of life concepts or areas that we may want to measure in a social care wellbeing context rather than a healthcare context. So if you can just put some words in, it should come up on the screen. So safety, loss of income, housing, equity, social connectedness, the home environment, financial issues, feeling safe, happiness, employment. This is great. So just really looking at social connectedness, I think I've said that already, and safety, efficiency, and it keeps moving, equity. Fantastic. So the Euroqual group thought that developing a new questionnaire was a good idea as well, to actually start to incorporate some of these new concepts in. And they started an ambitious project to develop a measure that included both health and well-being. So the aims of the project were to measure the impact of health treatments and social care interventions, including physical and mental health, and broader qualities of life aspects as judged by service users themselves and those impacted, such as caregivers. The measures would need to be scored to reflect people's values so that it could be used in trials. And the EQ-HWB, the EQ Health and Wellbeing measure, was developed by the Extending the Quality Group, including a large number of project partners and international collaborators. There were around 4 stages in the development, starting with an extensive search of the qualitative literature on quality of life research and data analysis of existing surveys, followed by extensive testing and refining through interviews with members of the public and a large survey. And there's plenty of information online. You can Google to get more information about that. And the outcomes were a long form of 25 items and a short form of 9 items, both of which are still in the experimental stage. So let's have a look at how the EQ Health and Wellbeing measure compares to the EQ5D. So the EQ5D has 5 domains: mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain, discomfort, and anxiety, depression. And the EQ-HWB has 9 dimensions. So in black, you can see that the domains of day-to-day activities, getting around inside and outside, physical pain, anxiety and sadness, depression, are similar to the EQ5D. But in blue, you can see the added concepts of loneliness, control, concentration, thinking, and exhaustion are much more specific to a social care setting and may pick up important quality of life elements for caregivers. And some of those we've picked up in the word cloud that you've done here as well. And all of those concepts would have been in the mix and would have been discussed during that process. So now we need to test this measure in a range of population types, and we've recently received funding from the Euroqual group to do qualitative interviews and data analysis of the EQ-HWB short form in a population of caregivers of children aged 8 or less who have experienced adversity. The research will be conducted through the Childhood Adversity Centre for Research Excellence. The CRE aims to bring together people with lived experience and their families, practitioners, educators, researchers and policymakers from education, health and human services in a concerted effort to prevent significant mental health mobility load of depression, anxiety problems and suicidality experienced by children living in adversity and exposed to adverse childhood experiences. That's a pretty long sentence, but that's the aims as from the website. So the intervention through the CRE is based at a hub in a disadvantaged area of Melbourne. And as part of the CRE evaluation, we will test whether the EQ-HWB is reliable and valid in this population, preference weights for a UK population for the measure should be available by the end of the year. If we find that the measure is working well in this population, we'll be able to use the UK weights to conduct cost utility analysis. So in summary, we need good ways to collect utility values that are meaningful in the social care context, and EQHWB may be a valid and reliable measure in this area. Our research will look at whether it is suitable to measure quality of life for parents and carers of children who have been experiencing adversity. It would also be great to have reliable child-specific utility measures, and Christine and I are working on a large MRF-funded project to this end, which Christine will talk about more in the next presentation. Missed that one. Huge thanks to the ISPOR Victoria and Tasmania student chapter team for inviting me to speak today, and to the Childhood Adversity CRE team, support from my colleagues at the Health Economics Unit, University of Melbourne, and thank you very much for coming along and listening and for participating today. And I'll hand back to Martin. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for your wonderful presentation. We encourage all participants to put in their questions for Kate in the Q&A box, and Kate will be happy to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Mpundu-Kaambwa. Dr. Christine Mpundu-Kaambwa is a research fellow in the Health and Social Care Economics Group, College of Nursing and Health Sciences at Flinders University. Her research interests are in the measurement and evaluation of health-related quality of life. Her current research centers on health economics and health services research methods to improve the quality of life of children and people with long-term health conditions or disabilities. Previously, she has worked as a researcher for several other institutions, including the University of Adelaide, Birmingham, and the World Bank. Dr. Mpundu-Kaambwa has published in high research impact peer-reviewed journals, including some of the leading journals such as Pharmacoeconomics, Quality of Life Research, Medical Journal of Australia, and the British Medical Journal series. Dr. Mpundu-Kaambwa is the communications convener for the International Health Economics Association Special Interest Group on Economics of Children's Health and Wellbeing. She's also a member of the International Society of Pharmaceuticals and Outcomes Research and the Australian Health Economics Society. I will now invite Dr. Mpundu-Kaambwa to present today. Yep, great.
Thanks, Martin. I'll just try and share my screen. Put that in slideshow. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'm really excited about doing this presentation. Thank you so much, Martin, for that introduction. And yes, I'll just dig into it. So yeah, my name is Christine Mpundu-Kaambwa, and I'm a research fellow at Flinders University, and I'm based within the Caring Futures Institute. Now, for my presentation, I'm going to look at using measures of health-related quality of life in child populations and settings, and particularly going to zero in on the methods and the challenges for decision making. Now, measures of health-related quality of life are increasingly being used in health services research to inform healthcare resource allocation decisions. And this is not only in adult populations, and I know Kate has spoken about these measures within the adult populations, but this also includes child health research, where it's necessary to evaluate the impact of disease and treatment on child populations. Now, measures of health-related quality of life facilitate the assessment of an individual's subjective viewpoint of their well-being, health status, or quality of life at a single point in time, and are usually collected via standardized questionnaires. And these are pretty much simply known as measures or instruments. Now, these measures of health-related quality of life can be distinguished into utility-based and non-utility-based measures. And I think Cate touched a bit on this. Now, with the utility-based measures, these use a simple summative scoring system whereby individual items or dimensions are used to generate summary scores. Whilst utility-based measures produce health state utility estimates, which is a key component of cost utility analysis. And as Cate mentioned earlier on, she went through the different forms of economic evaluation, and cost utility is the most prevalent form of economic evaluation. And this is recommended by many regulatory authorities, including the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, PBAC, and the Medical Services Advisory Committee here in Australia. And it's also mandated by the National Institute for Care and Excellence in the UK, which is known as NICE. So yeah, so there is a lot of recommendation around using cost utility analysis in terms of the economic evaluation forms that are available for use. Now, I thought I'd talk about a bit about the why of using utility instruments and what the health state utilities are. So in order for us to fully appreciate measures of health-related quality of life and their use in health economics, would need to zero in on health state utility and look at the why and the how. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, utility is a major component of cost utility, and this is measured in terms of QALYs. So that's the quality adjusted life years, which is a combination of length of life, known as survival, and quality of those life years, which is sometimes referred to as Q. Now, the combination of the QALY and the cost is what is used in cost utility analysis, and to produce an outcome of cost per QALY, which is then leads us on to health technology assessment, where different interventions and therapies as well as technologies are compared. And the main outcome is to inform decisions around reimbursement of pharmaceuticals, as well as the adoption of new technologies. And this is mainly as a result of having scarce resources. As you're aware, funding bodies and governments usually have a very limited budget. So it's the onus is on them and other institutions to ensure that they pick the interventions and the technologies, therapies that will be most beneficial, but at the same time be the most cost effective of them all. Now, with health state utilities, we have the valuation side of things as well as the measurement side. Now, utilities can be quantified using either direct or indirect methods. So we know for like direct measurements, that typically involves measuring utility values directly from the person experiencing the health state under consideration, and generally referred to as the person's own health state valuation. And this is done by the use of methods such as time trade-off, TTO as standard gamble, discrete choice experiments, and Bestward scaling. Direct elicitation methods can also be may be applied actually with patient populations, as well as members of the general public who are asked to value their current health or a hypothetical health state. On the other hand, we have the indirect methods, and that involves the use of utility-based instruments. And I think Cate touched a bit on this as well. And these are called multi-attribute instruments. These are used to derive utility values. On the other hand, we also have another indirect method that is called mapping. And I'll just talk about it in the next slide. So with mapping, it's used to estimate health state utilities from non-utility-based outcome measures. Now, with mapping, this is where we derive a statistical algorithm to predict health state utilities from a non-utility-based measure by observing its statistical relationship with a generic-based utility instrument. Now, this is usually done in the event that you only have a non-utility-based instrument and you would like to calculate QALYs. The scoring or mapping algorithm that is generated from the mapping can be used to calculate utilities based on the relationship between the two instruments that is identified. Now, within the child health space, we have a few mapping studies, and I've picked two from those. So we have one where the kids screen 10 was mapped to child health utility 9 dimension, and a unique mapping algorithm for application was derived. And this work was done by Chen and colleagues. We have a second mapping paper, and this is one that I led on. This was mapping the child health utility 9 dimension scores from the Pediatric Quality of Life Inventory Short Form 15. This is work that was really interesting, and we came up with a great scoring algorithm, which we then later on validated in one of the large data sets here in Australia, the longitudinal study of Australian children. Now, in terms of measures of health-related quality of life, we will focus on utility-based measures because those are the most important for health economists. Now, these typically incorporate scoring algorithms, as I mentioned a bit earlier on, and are premised on preferences of general population samples for health states generated through the valuation methods, TTO, standard Gamble, and so on and so forth. Now, the utilities generated usually are anchored between 0, which is representing death, and 1 representing optimal health. And sometimes the utilities do go below 0, and these represent a health state of worse than death. Now, utilities, in terms of the instruments, utility instruments, they enable the calculation of quality adjusted life years for use in cost utility analysis. And that's why we emphasize on using utility measures, or rather that's why they are important, and as well as both in adult and child populations. Now, in terms of the existing utility-based measures that are available for use in children, we have some generic ones. So with the generic measures, they have a broad application across several contexts and applicable across all disease areas. So these include instruments such as the adolescent health utility measure. We have the assessment of quality of life, 6 dimension adolescent. We have the child health utility 9 dimension, CHU9D, and the EQ5DY, health utilities mark 2 and 3, the 16 dimensional and 17 dimensional, as well as the quality wellbeing scale. In terms of child condition-specific utility instruments, now these measures are designed to assess health outcomes in children with specific medical conditions. Of these, at the moment, we've identified 4 that can be used within child populations, and these are the pediatric asthma health outcome measure, the pediatric atopic dermatitis measure, the Aberrant behavior checklist utility index, as well as the cerebral palsy 6 dimension. Now, I'll just tackle some of the key issues in measuring health in children and adolescents. And these have been identified in a review of guidelines for proxy and self-completion of pediatric health-related quality of life instruments, which is work that we are currently working on. Cate and I are currently working on an MRFF looking at child health. And this is some of the work that we are currently looking at. And this review has identified some of these key challenges and issues that are involved in measuring health within child populations. So I'll just go into some of the issues that have been identified in there. So one key question is, so who should complete the instrument or the questionnaire? Should it be a self-report or interviewer assisted, or should it be a proxy? We know that very young children and older children with severe health conditions or developmental delay may lack the necessary cognitive and language skills for self-report. And some studies that have looked at comparisons in terms of quality of life assessment between the self-report and proxy report have identified divergence. Though some of them have reported convergence in the two, overall, most of them have been, well, generally, most of them have been shown to be divergent. So those questions are key within child populations. The other thing that has come up is that proxies, particularly parents, tend to under and over-report the child health status. So within the child health area, we are still trying to determine which report should we go with. Should we go with the self-report, or should we go with the interview-assisted or proxy? Another key question is the minimum age at which a child can reliably self-report their health. Now, a recent study by PROMs and colleagues, they have suggested that not less than 5 years. Then we have another study. Now, this is Stevens and colleagues, and they developed the Child Health Utility 9 Dimension coming out of Sheffield University in the UK. And they recommended a minimum age of 7 years. But then again, we have a recent study that was published this year, and it's recommending 10 years. And this is a study that was done by Powell and colleagues. So these are questions that are still hanging around the area of child health and measuring of health-related quality of life within this population. The aim of the key thing is that's come out so far within one of the key papers is a recommendation to aim for self-report wherever possible, including child populations. So this is something that to keep in mind when you're deciding on which instrument to go for or which minimum age you should use for self-report. We've also looked at the recall period. So what recall period should we use? Again, this area, there is very limited evidence. And we know that looking at the different instruments that are available for use within child populations, they are very variable recall time periods. Now we know for the EQ5DY, the recall period is today. The CHU9D recall period is today or last night. For the ACOR60, the recall period is the past week. And there are so many variations, including the health utilities of 2 and 3. And so just determining what is the appropriate recall period is something that we're still trying to determine within child health. Now, this review by Coombs and colleagues recommends a recall period of 24 to 48 hours for children younger than 8 years of age. And recall seems reliable for 7 to 14 days from 8-year-olds and onwards. The fourth key issue to consider is ethical considerations. Now, there are some questions we ask adults, but should not ask children regarding their health. We need to balance ethical concerns against empowerment. How do you determine whether questions that's being asked to a child regarding their health is ethical, or it's against their empowerment, and vice versa. We also need to consider concerns about knowledge and disclosure of conditions in specific health concerns. And the general recommendation is always to seek ethical approval when doing research with children. That way you ensure that you are within the remit of the law. Now, in conclusion, measures of health-related quality of life can facilitate the assessment of effect of disease and treatment on quality of life from an individual's perspective. We know that self-report of health-related quality of life is generally considered more reliable and accurate than proxy assessment, and this applies to child populations as well. The other key thing that has come out is that the limitations that I've highlighted present challenges for research that assess health-related quality of life for children and economic evaluations of child health interventions. So all this is work in progress as we work on the MRFF project looking at children. We hope to answer some of these questions. I have a list of references. If anyone is interested, please feel free to get in touch and I can click them on to you. Thank you. Please feel free to ask questions, make comments or suggestions. Very happy to hear from you. Thanks. Over to you, Martin. Hello.
Thank you, Christine. That was fantastic.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thanks.
So thank you, Christine. Thank you, Cate. Those were fantastic presentations. I was just thinking like how much I didn't know about utility-based measures and how much is still, and how interesting really it is for us doing like health economic evaluations, because I think it's something that sometimes, or at least I know that I have overlooked. And I realize like the weight that it has in the final conclusions of the studies. So definitely a really interesting topic and a very interesting field. So we are going to now open the floor for questions. We do have some questions already in the chat. The first one was from Rachel. Rachel, do you want me to read it? I think I have to, yeah. So Rachel asked to Cate, is there a similar measure that exists in regards to EQHWB? Is there a similar measure that exists or is being developed for child self-report in the social care sector?
Thanks so much for that question, Rachel. Just firstly, just to say that the EQHWB is broader than just carers. It's aimed at carers and care recipients as well. So it's not just aimed for carers. The first thing I really need to say is that we're still working on how to measure utility values for children in the healthcare sector. And that's what our Big Quokka project that Christine and I are working on at the moment is working on. So we've got 6 projects looking at different aspects of how we can collect and measure quality of life to develop utilities for children. That said, and then there's also the issue of self-report as well, which Christine's touched on today. So, I mean, how if we do ask these questions, how are our children able to report for themselves? Yeah, so, but the other thing I'd like to say is that I think probably the next step would be to test the EQHWB on an adolescent population in a social care sector and see how that worked. But I'm really keen to probably take that further as well, and just see how we can try and measure children's well-being who have experienced adversity and how we can actually do that and collect utilities from that. So thank you so much for that question. That's just like bang on topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We have also a question from Tan. Tan, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, curious to know how the instruments, how if it does account for cultural differences. For example, some of the countries, primarily if it's in English, there might be some different interpretations of the questions. So does it account for those kind of issues?
I'll just say something first and then pass over to Christine. Just in terms of the development of the EQHWB, it was had a very broad international sort of focus. Like there was probably mainly from Europe and the UK and Australia, but I think that I probably don't know enough about how they worked on those cultural aspects, but I know that that was a central part of it, and they did have a lot of international partners working on that. But it's a great question, and I know that the EQ5D is used in a lot of places around the world, and I personally don't have enough experience to say how much it's used in developing countries. Christine, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think my thoughts are pretty similar to yours. I don't know if any of the instruments did look into cultural aspects when they were developed, because I know instruments such as the CHU9D did loads of qualitative interviews with young children and got their views, including those that had health conditions. But I haven't seen a mention of cultural issues in the development of the ones that I've looked at. Most of the instruments are to be specific within the child health space. So yeah, that's something I would have to look up and just see if there's anything. But off the top of my head, I can't remember any cultural issues that were investigated in the development of the instruments.
That's a really important question, though.
That's right, it is, yes, yeah.
But in the child utility space, we're still kind of working on some of the even more basic questions than that.
Yes,
but that would be
that's
definitely
right.
something to go, a good place to go next. Yeah.
Thank you, both. We have another question from Gigi. Gigi is asking to Christine, says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Could you please tell me what you recommend to measure quality of life among children under 5?
Right, thank you so much for your question, Jackie. In terms of measuring quality of life in children under 5, the instrument that I'm aware of is the CHU9D, but that's not self-report. That you would have to have a proxy version, and there's some guidance notes available. If you did a Google search, University of Sheffield and CHU9D, you will be able to get, I think, contact detail. And once you get in touch with them, they'll be able to send you the guidance notes for measuring quality of life in children under 5 years of age.
Thank you, Christine. We have another question from Hong. If we have available quality of life estimates measured in other countries such as the UK, can we map these estimates to Australian population by using Australian value set?
Do you want me to start on that one, Christine?
Actually, do you mind repeating the question, Clara? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So the question is, if we have available quality of life estimates that were measured in other countries such as the UK, can we map these estimates to Australian population by using an Australian value set?
So I'll start and then you can have a go. So the answer, the kind of the short answer is yes. If we don't have value sets for Australia, we can start by using the UK value set. So that's what we'd be planning to do in the first instance with the EQHWB, because we're waiting for the value set to come out of the UK for that, and it'll be quite some time before we have a value set for the EQHWB in Australia. But there's been some really fascinating research done on these utility measures, comparing the value sets across different countries. And I wish I could just pull one of the graphs out of my sleeve, but I can't, I don't have one on me. But they're really interesting to look at. So if you can find any presentations where people have actually, or papers where people have actually talked about that, just looking at the differences, which countries map more closely to others, the differences between like the Asian countries and European countries is interesting as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating question and produces some really interesting looking graphs. Christine?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, that's pretty much what Cate has specified there. You can use value sets for another country, and that's something that we've done with the child health utility 9-dimension. Before we had Australian value sets, we were using the UK one until we had one developed. And recently there's been one developed for, I think, the Chinese population. So yes, the short answer is yes, you can use value sets from another country. Yeah.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Cate. Utsana, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was typing. It's a little bit long. Otherwise, I would use the microphone. So, well, I can read that out. So I understand that the EQHWB was developed from couples of generic MAUIs for adults. I just wonder, is there any discussion of using the same approach to develop the EQHWB set for children? And what we mentioned earlier or discussed earlier that you're going to test the EQHWU in adolescents population, but we know that instruments for adults might not be well applicable in children. So what's the rationale behind testing the adult EQHW in adolescents? That is one question. And the second question is there any thought of using the same approach to get the EQHWB in children, because Christine present there are a couple of the MAUI in kids as well, at least CSUNID, and then we have HUE 2, HUE 3, and there might be some others. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. In terms of the testing it in the adolescent population, that's just my idea of what I think I might like to do. There's no plans, as far as I'm aware, to do that at this stage. The EQHWB is still in the experimental version, so it hasn't actually got to the stage where we've got the final wording. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing qualitative interviews funded through the Euroqual group, so that we can look at how that's being just if there's any wording issues or things that need to be pinned down further before we go ahead and finalise that question. So it will be like this research won't be completed until probably mid next year. So there's going to be quite a bit of time before we actually even get that full version. So the idea of doing testing it in adolescent population, I don't know if the Euroqual group has any intention of doing that at this stage, but it's something that would be quite a way down the line. I liked your idea of like maybe building up from scratch. Like you mentioned, how the EQHWB was developed, going back to the qualitative data. I thought that was a really interesting concept. I don't know whether the Euroqual group is having any sort of discussions about looking at that for wellbeing for children, but that's something that I personally would be really interested in. I think I've covered all the bits of your question, but in terms of the those child-specific utility measures, there's a lot of work going on in Australia and internationally, looking at which of those, which of those are measuring what, and and some of them, like the HUE 2 and the HUE 3, maybe not quite as child-friendly as some of the measures, and so we're hoping that through the Quokka project that we'll actually be able to make some give some good advice to researchers about which measures are good for which age groups. Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to Kate's response there, some of the work that we're doing within the MRFF project is trying to develop some pictorial content and audio content to enhance the CHU9D instrument so that children with learning difficulties and impairments can be able to self-report their quality of life. So those are some of the things that we're doing within the child health space to ensure that instruments have that inclusivity within the disability health sector.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're comparing to the quality of life measurements in children, adolescents, and adult. We still have a lot of rooms to grow, especially I'm looking at the evaluation of the instruments for kids, even the EQ5D-Y itself, it's still like have a methodological development at this stage. Yeah, still have a lot, and I'm pretty sure that your work in the Quokka projects and other like relevant quality of life measure in kids, it's gonna bring up a lot of insights in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a very valid point, because most of the instruments that we are currently using within the child health space were designed for adults, and then we're later on adapted for child population. So yeah, absolutely, we need to have more instruments that are specifically designed for children from the onset, such as a CHU9D, which had children in mind at the development stage.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from Claudia. She's asking, what would you consider best practice in the development and content validation of child or adolescent PROMs or quality of life measures? And is there, because the current guidance focuses on the development of this type of instruments for adults only?
You want to go first, Christine?
Yeah, I think the best way is to use frameworks such as the COSMIN. I think that should be applicable to developing instruments within the child health space. I think that's the other issue that I touched on, where we don't have guidelines at the moment, specifically for children in terms of self-report and proxy completion. Most times we rely on adult frameworks. So off the top of my mind, I think we could still at the moment use the adult frameworks, and I'm thinking things like the COSMIN checklists. Yeah, I can't think of any other framework at the moment. Yeah, but there should be some out there which can be applied.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting as we go through with the Quokka project, just seeing which of those instruments for children seems to be working best, and in which populations.
Thank you both. I actually have also some questions. So my first question, Kate, is in relation to these new dimensions that are being added to be able to measure quality of life in social care. I was thinking that maybe some of these dimensions are also valid for healthcare environments, because I was thinking loneliness or social connectedness. That's probably something that for some diseases, it's really important regarding your quality of life. So it seems that it really should be really interrelated.
Yeah, what a great question. I guess the EQ5D has been used. It's very widely used, and it's aiming just to pick up those health questions. And so we're trying to broaden that by including health and well-being. But you're right in that well-being is a really big factor in health, and how a health condition affects someone's well-being. It would be really interesting to see if people started using the health and well-being measure for specific conditions and something like that as well. But yes, but that from the aim, that's such a cool idea. But I think, in the first instance, we are trying to capture something different that's not captured in healthcare. in healthcare only questions. But yeah, no, that's a really excellent comment. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, Kate. Christine, I also have a question for you, because I was a little bit struck about the recall period. It's something that I never thought about, you know, when I read even the Qualis paper, I never think, oh, when did they ask these patients? And it's such an important question. And my question is it that kids have like a different kind of experience of time, and hence they have like different periods when we can do the recall? Or how does that work? Like, because I noticed that for younger kids, it's only valid when it's like in a shorter time period. And I guess that maybe it's because the way that kids recall is quite different to adults.
Yeah, so in terms of the recall, that's a fantastic question. And that's something we're looking at in the systematic review I mentioned, where we're looking at self and proxy completion of instruments and the guidelines that are available for using these instruments. So what we've found is that different instruments will give you a different recall date. So the CA290 is today and last night. The EQ5DY is today. ACOR60, that's I think that's 4 weeks. That's pretty similar to, I know the Huey. I think the Huey does present health 1, 2, 3, and 4 weeks. So it just depends on the instrument developers and what recall period they deem to be the right one for children. But what I do know also is from doing interviews with children, some of them have a really good memory. I know we did a survey and we did some face-to-face interviews with children 5 going on to 11. And the 5 and the 6-year-olds, the recall period was very erroneous. You know, we had the parents sitting in and the parents would be like, no, but that wasn't 3 or 4 days ago. That was the other day or, you know, last week. And so I would say 5 to 6-year-olds have a problem with recall. And I think it's best that they have a proxy to respond for them. But we noticed with the 7-year-olds going upwards, they were fine. They had a really good recall. And when we compared their responses to the parents' responses, there was convergence, which shows that they are good with their recall and in terms of self-reporting, their quality of life. Yeah, so I can't put a specific time on the recall, but what I know at the moment is there's just a lot of variability. And so we just need some clear guidelines to say, this is what we should be going with. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Just add one small point to that as well, is that if you say at the beginning of the questionnaire that what the recall period is, but don't re-specify it again, people might flick over that, not really take it in, and then just continue on with the questionnaire without a specific recall period in their mind. Yeah, so that's another aspect that I think we need to really sort of think about, because some of the questionnaires, and I'm not quite sure which one Christine will probably know, but will actually say in the last week, in the last week. But some of them will just say at the top, you know, this is the recall period, and then you kind of just don't even sort of think about it again.
Yeah. That's right. I know with the CH290, I talk a lot about the Child Health Utility 9 dimension because that's the instrument I've worked with a lot. And yeah, they do specify the quality of life. So in each response, they do specify it's today that we're looking at. But for some, they just mention at the top of the survey, and that's it. And that can be very confusing, as Kate has explained, as you're going through the questions. If you've got 10, 15 questions, by the time you're getting to the last question, you're like, what are we talking about? Is this now or was that yesterday? Yeah, so yeah, those are issues we really need to have some guidelines on.
I mean, definitely, you know, just from my point of view right now, I think it will help me a lot if in every question it says last week, blah, blah, because it will help me focus. Definitely,
right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for answering all our questions. I don't know if somebody has any other questions, but we are already a little bit over time. This was fantastic, really. I'm now very fascinated by this topic, so thank you so much. for sharing your expertise with us and your knowledge and your time today. And if there is no further questions, I think we will close it here. We hope to see you all soon in another webinar. And thank you, Christine, and thank you, Cate, for being here today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Clara.
Thank you.